The scorching sun hung over Thebes, casting long shadows across the great stone pyramids. The sound of whips cracking against flesh echoed through the fields, where hundreds of slaves toiled beneath the merciless heat. Their backs were bent, their hands raw from carving limestone, yet their spirits were not entirely broken. Among them was Kael, a man unlike the others. His body bore the same scars, but his eyes burned with defiance. Unlike the rest, he did not bow his head in silent acceptance. He watched, he listened, and he waited. For years, the slaves had whispered of freedom, but no one dared to act. Fear of Pharaoh Seti II's wrath kept them in chains. The royal guards were ruthless, and the punishments for disobedience were worse than death. Until today, as Kael lifted a heavy stone onto a cart, he noticed a young boy collapse nearby. The guards did not hesitate. A whip cracked through the air, lashing against the boy's frail back. The child screamed, his small hands clawing at the dirt. Kael froze. A fire lit in his chest, rage unlike anything he had felt before. His fingers clenched into fists as the guard raised the whip again. No. The word left his lips before he could stop it. The guard turned, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "What did you say, slave?" he sneered, stepping toward Kael. The other workers stilled, eyes darting between Kael and the approaching guard. Silence fell over the worksite. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kael took a slow step forward, unafraid. "I said no." His voice was calm, but his muscles tensed like a lion ready to strike. The guard laughed, raising the whip. "Then you will learn your place." Before the whip could fall, Kael moved. With a strength fueled by years of suffering, he grabbed the guard's wrist and snapped it with a sickening crack. A gasp rippled through the slaves. The guard screamed, stumbling backward, clutching his broken hand. Kael did not stop. He grabbed the guard's sword and drove it into his chest. For a moment, time stood still. Then, the world exploded into chaos. The other guards rushed forward, swords drawn, but the slaves had seen enough. The years of silent suffering, of watching their families be beaten, of knowing they would die in chains, all of it ended today. A roar erupted from the workers. The rebellion had begun. The desert wind carried the sound of battle cries across the Nile. The slaves had risen. Kael stood in the center of the chaos, his stolen sword dripping with blood. Around him, workers turned warriors fought with anything they could find: stones, tools, even their bare hands. The guards, though trained in combat, were outnumbered. The slaves, fueled by years of suffering, fought with a desperation that no amount of discipline could match. "Push them back!" Kael roared, his voice cutting through the battlefield. They surged forward, overwhelming the remaining guards. Within moments, the worksite belonged to them. But Kael knew this was only the beginning. Deep within the royal palace, Pharaoh Seti II sat upon his golden throne, his face unreadable as a trembling messenger knelt before him. "My Pharaoh, the slaves have rebelled." The man's voice shook. "They have taken the stone quarry. The guards, they are dead." A heavy silence filled the chamber. The Queen Mother gasped. The high priests exchanged worried glances. The royal advisors whispered among themselves. Seti II did not move. "Who leads them?" he finally asked, his voice dangerously calm. The messenger swallowed hard. "A man named Kael." For the first time, the pharaoh's expression changed. "Kael," he murmured. A memory flickered in his mind. A boy from the palace kitchens, a servant's son who had once stared into his eyes without fear. So, it was him. The pharaoh's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then let him come," he whispered. "Let him try to take what is mine." Then he turned to his generals. "Burn their camps, kill the rebels, and bring me Kael, alive." That night, Kael and his growing army of freed slaves took refuge in an abandoned temple outside the city. Their numbers had doubled. Word of their defiance had spread like wildfire, and more runaways joined them by the hour. But with victory came fear. "We cannot defeat the Pharaoh's army," one man muttered, sharpening a stolen dagger. "We don't need to," Kael answered. "We just need to take the city before they expect it." The plan was madness, a direct assault on Thebes. But Kael did not fear madness. He welcomed it. And so, beneath the cover of darkness, the slaves marched toward the capital. Not as prisoners, but as conquerors. The city of Thebes stood like an impenetrable beast, its towering walls carved with the victories of pharaohs past. But tonight, it would witness something unprecedented, a rebellion marching to its gates. Kael stood at the front, his army of former slaves armed with stolen weapons and burning rage. Behind him, men and women who had once known only chains now held swords and torches, ready to claim their freedom. "No more fear," Kael called out, his voice rising over the night. "No more masters. Tonight, we take back our lives." A roar erupted from the rebels. Then, they charged. Inside the royal palace, Pharaoh Seti II stood upon his balcony, watching the torches moving through the darkness like a rising storm. The rebellion had come. By his side, his general Rahotep, a man as ruthless as the pharaoh himself, studied the enemy with a smirk. "Fools," Rahotep muttered. "They come like animals, with no discipline, no strategy. They will be crushed." Seti II said nothing, his eyes locked on Kael, who led the charge. "You should have stayed in the dust where you belonged," the pharaoh whispered. Then, with a single motion, he raised his hand. The war drums boomed, and the gates of Thebes swung open. Out poured the pharaoh's elite guard, their armor gleaming in the firelight, their spears raised. The battle had begun. Swords clashed, arrows screamed through the air, and the streets of Thebes ran red with blood. Kael fought like a man possessed, his blade carved through soldiers, his war cry shaking the night. Around him, his people fought with everything they had, not for gold, not for power, but for freedom. But the pharaoh's forces were relentless. One by one, Kael's men fell. The rebellion, though fierce, was outmatched in skill and numbers. Still, Kael refused to stop. He pushed forward, breaking through the lines, his only goal clear, reaching the palace. If he could face Seti II, if he could end the pharaoh, the city would be theirs. But fate had other plans. As Kael and his warriors stormed through the city, cutting down the last of the gate guards, a horrific sound filled the air. The gates of Thebes, slamming shut. Kael spun around. The streets behind him, once filled with his rebels, were now flooded with Pharaoh's soldiers. "No," he whispered. From atop the city walls, Seti II watched with a satisfied smirk. "Did you think I would not see this coming, Kael?" His voice rang out. The rebels had walked into a trap. Kael looked around. They were surrounded. No escape, no reinforcements. But if this was the end, he would make sure the pharaoh bled before he fell. With a final roar, Kael raised his sword and charged straight toward the palace. Kael ran through the burning streets of Thebes, his sword dripping with the blood of Pharaoh's men. Around him, his army was falling, crushed by the overwhelming might of Seti II's forces. But he did not stop. He had only one goal: reach the palace, reach the pharaoh, and end this war with his own hands. With every step, the city walls seemed to close in around him. His people were dying. But if he could kill Seti II, the rebellion might still have a chance. So he ran, straight into the lion's den. The golden doors of the royal palace burst open as Kael stormed inside, cutting down the last of the guards who dared stand in his way. And there, waiting for him, Pharaoh Seti II. He stood at the top of the throne room steps, dressed in gold and red, his arms crossed, his face calm, as if he had been expecting this. "You've come a long way, Kael," Seti II said smoothly, his voice carrying through the empty chamber. "I almost admire your determination." Kael raised his sword, his chest heaving. "This ends now." The pharaoh smirked. "Yes, it does." With a flick of his wrist, the palace doors slammed shut behind Kael. From the shadows, dozens of royal guards emerged, their weapons gleaming. Kael's blood ran cold. It was another trap. The first guard lunged. Kael dodged. His sword flashed, cutting the man down. A second, a third. He kept fighting. Blades slashed at his arms, his legs, but he did not stop. He couldn't stop. He was a slave no longer. He would not die on his knees. "Is this your power, Pharaoh?" Kael roared, his voice shaking the walls. "Hiding behind your men?" Seti II simply smiled. Then, with a nod, his men stepped back, and the pharaoh descended the steps. "Very well, Kael," he said, drawing his own sword. "If you wish to die by my hand, I will grant you that honor." Kael tightened his grip, and the battle truly began. Steel clashed against steel. Sparks flew. Kael was fast, fueled by anger, by desperation. He swung with all his strength. But Seti II was trained, disciplined. He dodged every attack effortlessly, his counterstrikes calculated. Slash, Kael barely blocked. Thrust, Kael stumbled back, blood dripping from a fresh wound. The pharaoh was toying with him. Kael gritted his teeth. He lunged forward, aiming for Seti's heart. But the pharaoh sidestepped with ease, and in one fluid motion, he drove his blade straight into Kael's stomach. Kael gasped, the pain blinding. The sword was deep, too deep. His knees buckled, his fingers trembled. Behind him, the sounds of battle were fading. His people were dead or captured. The rebellion was over. Pharaoh Seti II leaned in, whispering, "Did you really believe you could stand against the gods?" Kael looked up, his vision swimming, blood dripping from his lips. And then he smiled. "The gods are watching you too, Pharaoh." The pharaoh's smirk faltered. Then Kael fell. Kael collapsed onto the marble floor of the pharaoh's palace, his blood pooling beneath him. His breath came in ragged gasps. The rebellion had failed. Above him, Seti II stood victorious, his sword still dripping red. The room was silent, except for the distant screams of dying rebels beyond the palace walls. The pharaoh sighed, wiping his blade. "Did you think you could change the world, slave?" he asked, his voice almost amused. "Did you truly believe a man like you could stand against a god?" Kael coughed, blood staining his lips. His strength was fading, but his spirit was not broken. "I never wanted to fight a god, Seti," he rasped. "I wanted to show men that gods can bleed." For the first time, the pharaoh hesitated. And then, a sound shattered the silence. A roar, not from Kael, not from the soldiers, but from the people of Thebes. Beyond the palace walls, the city was burning. The rebels had fallen, yes, but their fight had ignited something greater. The people, the workers, the servants, the oppressed, had seen Kael stand against the pharaoh. And now, they stood up too. The streets erupted in chaos. Markets were overturned, torches were thrown, statues of Pharaoh were pulled down. The rebellion had failed, but the revolution had just begun. Seti II turned to his guards. "Crush them!" he roared. But it was too late. His own people were against him now. The pharaoh turned back to Kael, rage twisting his face. "This is your doing," he spat. Kael, lying in a pool of his own blood, laughed. "No, Pharaoh," he whispered, his voice weak but victorious. "This was always their fight." Seti II lifted his sword to finish Kael once and for all. But before he could strike, the doors of the palace burst open. His own guards rushed in, panicked, terrified. "My Pharaoh," one of them stammered, "the palace is lost." Seti II froze. The realization hit him like a blade to the heart. He had won the battle, but he had lost his kingdom. The fires of Thebes burned through the night. By dawn, Seti II was dead, whether by his own men, by the rebels, or by the gods themselves, no one could say. His empire crumbled. His name, once carved into stone, was now scratched out of history. But Kael's name lived on, not as a pharaoh, not as a king, but as a man who dared to stand. The rebellion failed, but the revolution succeeded. The gods do not rule forever. The people do. The end